Giles Brown.
Let's talk.
Fractured union, politics, sovereignty, and the fight to save the UK. The question of the United Kingdom's survival, once taken for granted, looms large in British politics. This book, Fractured Union, uncovers the roots of today's crisis, revealing MPs and civil servants' assumptions on their understanding of the union and profound pessimism within politics about its long-term viability. It is the subject of a new book by Michael Kenny. I'd like to say that Michael joins us live on the line. Good morning to you, Michael.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us this morning. It is an interesting situation we find ourselves in. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, this would have been perhaps unthinkable, the thought of a fractured union. I think that the only thing that we had back in those days was sort of holiday cottages in Wales getting torched.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. If you think about across that period, I mean, things have changed a lot. I don't think many people 50 years ago would have really taken that seriously, the idea that Britain might break apart. But though it's interesting, you can also see the origins of things that have become to the surface more recently. In that period, I mean, you saw nationalism beginning to rise in Scotland and Wales, beginning to make sort of inroads in electoral politics. But really, I guess what I'm talking about in the book is the real pressure that's been put on the union, particularly about Brexit. I mean, that's been the major event. But I think other things too have actually brought this issue to the fore.
Can you argue then perhaps it's not a huge swell of nationalist feeling, or it is a huge swell of nationalist feeling that has been stoked and had rocket fuel put under it by perhaps the sort of Westminster-centric view that some would say successive governments have had?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think inevitably this is a complicated thing and there are lots of different factors. I think you'd have to, what I sort of tried to do in the book is to start with the question, well, why has nationalism grown up in different parts of the UK? Why have different people in different parts of it begun to become sort of more disenchanted with the model of government, the idea that they are part of this union state that brings together, different peoples, nations, regions? Now, the fact is that many people are still content with that. But what is striking, I think, is that you've seen Welsh and Scottish nationalism begin to emerge. Obviously, in Northern Ireland, there's long been a debate about the constitutional position of Northern Ireland. But I think the really striking thing is evidence that in England, too, people are becoming a bit more disenchanted with things and feel that the union isn't giving them the kind of deal that they want. And perhaps even in some parts of England, people feeling a bit neglected in comparison with how the state treats other bits of their own country.
It's an interesting, because we had with great fanfare the introduction of a levelling up policy. People were referring to those great powerhouses of the Industrial Revolution: Newcastle, Liverpool, Leeds, Manchester, Birmingham, and yet, here we are with a major high-speed rail link, which is being cancelled. We have, obviously a lot of those red wall seats are now, if you believe the poll that came out on Monday, are going to revert back to Labour in the forthcoming election.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a really important set of developments there in those parts of England that are, I mean, it's different areas really. There are those places that were once industrial sort of powerhouses, but also people in many of the areas in small towns and rural areas. I mean, you can see there's quite a lot of evidence that people have become increasingly sort of disenchanted. It's not just that they don't like the particular government of the day, but a greater sense of almost disenchantment with the system and with the outcomes and the model of government, and very much the kind of London-centric focus of it. Now, I think you can track that back actually into the mid-2000s. It goes back some way. And I think it's one of the sort of underlying dynamics that brings Brexit to the fore, because the polling shows that those people were the most likely to want the UK to leave the European Union. So that has had a huge impact upon all of our lives and upon the sort of future of the UK, not just within Europe, but I think as a country.
And also it put huge impetus I mean, this is obviously before Nicola Sturgeon going, but it put huge emphasis on Scotland becoming independent because they didn't want to leave Brexit. They didn't want to leave Europe. They saw the benefits of being within Europe, and there was a huge schism of, well, okay, the famous thing was, okay, well, you know, we will if the Catalans, and I'll come on to Spain if I may, just as an example, if the Catalans are going for independence, you know, trying to, you know, Scotland's got a much stronger case for independence, and they can rejoin Europe.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, if you cast your mind back to that independence referendum, 2014, one of the most powerful arguments on the kind of pro-union side was that, well, look, if you become independent now, you'll leave the European Union. And the European Union was clearly pretty ambivalent about the idea of, not very keen really on the idea of suddenly one of its member states having a portion of it that would fall outside it and was not keen on Scotland having that kind of trying to rejoin following that. Now, that argument's gone. Since Brexit, that removes what is a very powerful argument. On the other hand, though, it's quite interesting. If you look at the sort of trends and support for independence, Brexit did give the Scottish independence cause a boost, but it's fallen back a little bit. And that's partly because the SNP, as a governing party now, is having its own troubles and tribulations. It's also, though, I think that, you know, the case still for leaving the UK, whilst appealing to many people, is still a difficult ask. I mean, in economic terms, that's an immensely difficult challenge for Scotland to undertake because England is its biggest market.
Which, I mean, again, I won't go into that, but I wanted to talk to you about the idea of union, because here in Spain, after the return to democracy, there was sort of an unwritten rule that the various autonomous regions of Spain would all come together to have a smooth passage. And now, some 40, 50 years later, we're seeing certain areas trying to break away, i.e. Catalonia, etc. But that's incredibly difficult. And perhaps it's a great idea for Scotland to be independent, but again, that idea of union and the seismic effect that would have on, I mean, it would basically pretty much break up you could say it could break up the UK, because then what do you do you have to come on with an accord about defence, communication, economic politics, etc., etc., etc. It's not as easy as saying, okay, let's just put a flag up and we'll all sing to Braveheart, for example.
Well, no, indeed. I mean, you know, we've seen as in the aftermath of the UK's decision to leave the European Union, that was certainly not straightforward and, you know, has created all sorts of challenges and posed tests for Britain's governing institutions. Imagine what it would be like to see a 300-year-old union come apart, and the degree of integration of Scotland and England and of their economies, their peoples, is that much greater. Nevertheless, I mean, you know, what you can see is that support for independence is remaining pretty steady. Recent polls, to the surprise of many, have suggested that idea gets about 40% of people in favour of it, and really, really strikingly, much younger voters are in favour of that. So you've got a real issue for the future there, because it continues to appeal to people, perhaps to their hearts. But even though there are all these real complicated logistics that would attach to it.
But we mentioned the B word, yeah, which in this part of the world we call it El Brexit, the Brexit situation, but also the pandemic, which gave an awful lot of people time for pause for thought and to question authority at all times. And this is perhaps another reason why there is more desire for independence in the breakup, because they saw what was going on in London. We had all these allegations coming out of Westminster, etc. And again, people thought, well, perhaps because Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland have enjoyed devolution, they can set budgets, etc. They thought, well, why not go the whole hog?
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing was in the pandemic was how support for independence in Scotland, and actually in Wales as well, which is, I mean, that's never really been a big cause, but it did begin to grow. And it looks like it sort of correlated with having these daily press conferences that Nicola Sturgeon was giving, Mark Drakeford, the First Minister of Wales, were giving. The idea that you suddenly you have your First Minister is there speaking to the nation and is showing in very vivid, practical ways how they are acting on your behalf. That seems to have given that cause a boost. At the same time, you're right. It was also the fact that Boris Johnson did not inspire much confidence in many people, particularly in the early months of the pandemic. But actually, sort of looking at it in the round, and now that the dust settled a little bit on those events, I mean, one of the really striking things here is that remember that those governments, Scotland and Wales, were in charge of most of their own rules about behaviour, lockdown rules and so on, because they were part of the devolution powers. And if we look at the sort of evidence about what happened overall, what difference did those policies make? I mean, it's quite a hard thing to judge, actually. But if you look at some of the key indicators, the really interesting thing is the different governments in the UK, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and then the British government deciding for England, all came up with a very similar result. That actually it did not make it that much of a difference, even though at the time it felt like, because they did introduce slightly different rules, and there was a lot of talk, there was a lot of hyping of the fact that, well, Wales is going to go its own way in this area or that area. Actually, in the round, it didn't make that much difference. And that's quite a striking and interesting finding, I think.
How hard has Westminster, the civil servants, politics in general, got to look at itself, though? Because the events, okay, we've had the Brexit vote, we had the pandemic, but there has never been a greater call from certain sections, and we haven't even touched on. Stormont hasn't sat now for how long? I mean, it's been a very long time since the Northern Ireland.
Months, yeah.
And perhaps it should be a warning. I know at the moment the government is got other things to concentrate on the back of last night's votes and the polls and whatever. But surely this should be a wake up call to politicians on all sides, on both sides of the house, that they need to stop living in the southeast and living in Westminster, and they need to get out again and get amongst the communities.
I mean, the interesting thing is, I think at the moment, the sort of working assumption in Westminster is that the union itself is not such a big issue. That the immediate threat is gone, because look at Scotland, look at the SNP, the trouble they're in, and the polls do suggest that Labour may, in the next general election, do quite well in Scotland, and of course it may well win a majority overall. Now, that would undoubtedly, in the short term, be probably a stabilising thing, a good thing for the union. But I think you're all right, that actually behind all that, there is that assumption. Westminster always assumes that unless there's a crisis, fine, we don't need to sort of deal with it or think about it. But there will be further crises. There will be difficulties. We have this complicated system of governance now, which means that there's lots of sort of overlap between the powers that the central government's got and then the devolved have got. We've obviously had this experience, and we'll still have it, of having a nationalist government in power in Scotland. So the conditions to have further rows are absolutely there. And I think at a more fundamental level, I mean, it's the question really I sort of wanted to pose in the book. It seems to me that, we've had devolution now for about, it's a quarter of a century, 25 years. I'm not, and that's a fairly developed model, and it's developed, it's continued to change in the different parts of the UK. It's not clear to me that deep within the bowels of British government, there's been a real kind of internalisation and acceptance of what that means. What that means is you have a system of you have a more complex system of government. There is power at different levels. There is politics now in different parts of the UK. And the responsibility of central government is to make this system work. And scoring points against the devolved governments, sort of winning short-term tactical battles, showing you're the one in charge, which we did see during the Brexit and the COVID pandemic, is not necessarily a recipe for sort of long-term stability in that model.
But you can argue that you need politicians who are mature enough to understand that and not do grandstanding in the House and go, well, this is what we're saying. And also, we talk about the Scottish Nationalist Party and their recent troubles, but they're not going to go away. Even though they've had a major wobble over the past 24 months, when they do get themselves organised again, and let's see what comes out of the next elections, then they're not a party that is going to go away quietly.
think that's right. And I mean, also Labour, if it is the next party of government, is going to inherit an incredibly difficult situation. That's true right across Europe, as we know. Economic factors, but there are sort of particular lots of issues about public service failures in the UK. It will be very busy dealing with all of that. It's how much room for manoeuvre it really has on the economy is open to question. What if Labour comes into power and doesn't deliver? What if it isn't able to produce the kind of things that people in Scotland might be hoping that a Labour government will produce for them? And then, will we go back? Will we lurch right back into an even more powerful sort of nationalist impulse? I mean, that's an open question. We don't know. But I think also a lot will depend on what happens in the Tory party. Where will they go?
One of the, because I host a Tuesday morning phone-in show where we discuss issues, which can be very entertaining if you're on a national Spanish radio station dealing with English-speaking residents and visitors here. One of the things that I heard during the Brexit, on the route to Brexit, was the word sovereign nation. Yeah, we are a sovereign nation. I think people are using that without the faintest idea of what actually that is. And one of the subtitles of your book is Politics, Sovereignty, and the Fight to Save the UK. What's your Michael? What's your understanding of sovereignty?
That's a tough one there for me. I mean, I think in the context of this stuff, what is so interesting about the Brexit debate was, as you say, I mean, one of the big, powerful arguments for Brexit was sovereignty. That we've actually gone into this, the UK's become part of a union, and the way in which the European Union has evolved, the argument has actually stretched us, has encroached on areas on which we actually would like to retain or reacquire our sovereignty. That, in a way, that argument is fairly straightforward, though when it comes to obviously the economic aspect of that is a much more complicated proposition than perhaps people made out. But what happens about sovereignty within the UK? I mean, that's always been the sort of spillover effect of that debate, is what does sovereignty mean in the UK context? And the honest answer to that is it's really quite blurred, the picture, because we've got this model, parliamentary sovereignty. Westminster is ultimately in charge. But Westminster has created these other parliaments, these other governments, and we'd moved some way down the road towards sort of thinking that they are quasi-sovereign, that they certainly have important powers that Westminster allows them to have. Brexit blew this up because suddenly here was central government saying, look, we need to go in this direction and we're going to have this kind of arrangement, what people call a hard Brexit deal. The governments of Scotland and Wales saying, no, that's not what we want to do. We've got some powers here. What about those? And I think we've been left with a very hazy conclusion to the sovereignty debate. It's going to carry on. Again,
I'm coming back to where I'm sitting at the moment here in Spain. The autonomous regions, and I'm sitting in Andalusia, which is by physical mass, it's a huge area, and we have obviously the Junta de Andalusia, the provincial government, which can set budgets on health, etc., and this is a model that tends to work because it's grown up politics, and that's saying something for Spain. Is the way for the UK to go then to give more authority to those areas, and also. And this is going to bite against Westminster, but also to give those areas. So give Manchester, give Liverpool, give Yorkshire, give Cornwall more devolutionary powers to set their own budgets, to have their own say, and then have the maturity to be able to handle that, rather than sort of saying, well, it's my ball, and if you don't like it, I'm not going to play.
Well, I mean, it's certainly the case that it's a general rule in politics, and that politicians don't like giving away power, and that's certainly been sort of there under the surface in the British case. Though at the same time, the devolution settlements that they've actually set up, particularly in Scotland, are pretty extensive, actually, if you compare with some of the those regions in Spain. I think, but what you're touching on there, I think is really interesting, is the case of England. So England, the largest part of the UK, and everyone assumed that England didn't need devolution because, it had its own government. It had its own parliament. It was called Westminster. And there was just the sort of working assumption that you might need devolution in these other areas because, it looked like they were getting squeezed out and they were losing out a bit systematically, but not in England. But now 20 years on, that debate's really changed. And you've seen people saying, well, actually, if Scotland and Wales are going to have these powers, we need our own sense of almost a sort of rebalancing. And then you've got this further complication in England that does it really make sense to have devolution at the level of England? Or should we go to our big cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and say, actually, these places need mayors with their own powers? And we've begun to move, as you know, down that road. We've got some big city mayors, like figures like Andy Burnham, but it's a half-built patchwork system. Westminster hasn't quite fully committed to it. It doesn't know quite how to take it forward. So it's a really interesting moment, actually, in this story, I think, the UK.
What do you hope that people take from Fractured Union? What do you hope that people? Is it to think where we are? Is it to raise the profile of the issue? What do you hope that people will learn, discover, and perhaps take from it?
I think, most of all, really, I wanted people to start thinking that or to take seriously the different possible futures for the UK. And I really wanted to sort of get people to think about the future now, not to leave it to the point where another crisis erupts or there's suddenly a demand for an independence referendum. Seems to me, and this I think is a lesson you can see from other countries, I think particularly Canada, after the Quebec referendum in 95, that came very, very close to independence. They acted then. They actually, they didn't wait for the next crisis. And it seems to me that we need a more mature debate about our union. We need to figure out how to get this model that we've got to work better. And I think above all, we need actually to get citizens involved in this conversation so they don't just feel that this is something that the politicians are going to sort of stitch up or do deals around.
As someone who has a Welsh father and a Scottish mother, there's no end to the passports that I could possibly get if everything becomes if everything gets devolved.
Indeed, these are complicated issues, and they involve us all, don't they? Personally, that's exactly the point, really, for me.
The book is called Fractured Union: Politics, Sovereignty and the Fight to Save the UK. It's by Michael Kenny, who we're speaking to today. Michael, if people want to find you online, is there a website? Do you do X, Twitter, wherever it calls itself? Are you on the socials? How can they find you?
Yeah, they can find me either they can find me on X, as it now is, but also if you look me up at the Bennett Institute at Cambridge University, you can find me there.
The book is called Fractured Union. It's by Michael Kenny. Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you this morning.
Likewise. Thank you, Giles.
Talk Radio Europe.